Welcome, Trinity Episcopal Church. Today is Tuesday, May the 12th, 2020. I have a special guest with me, Rick Wurth of the Children's Hope of Northern Kentucky, also a parishioner at Trinity and a former Roman Catholic priest. But I want to make a couple of announcements before Rick and I start talking about compassion. So just a couple of things coming up. I apologize that there was no link to our coffee hour last Sunday. So we're going to have a coffee hour redo this coming Sunday at 9:30. And we'll make sure that we send out the link to that so we can gather for coffee hour once again. And again, this Sunday is Youth Sunday. So our youth and Shannon Gemeinhart will be doing the service. So I'm looking forward to it. I get to stay home in my jammies and have a cup of coffee. So I'm looking forward to that. So Rick, welcome to our midweek meditation. I'm glad you're with us. We had been talking for a while, you and I, about maybe doing this because you deal a lot with compassion in your work. And so I want to read my definition of compassion once again. It's finding God's way to make true meaning in the midst of despair or indifference and acting on that truth. So finding God's way to make true meaning in the midst of despair or indifference and acting on that truth. And when you and I were planning this session yesterday, we were talking about the some historical precedents or some historical models for compassion. Did you want to talk to us a little bit about St. Francis of Assisi?
Yeah, I just, as I was sharing with you, Peter, I really appreciate the work you've been doing with the parish around the whole topic of compassion. It certainly has given me something to chew on, something to think about over the last few weeks. And your meditations, your reflections have really caused me to think about some of my seminary formation, in particular, a class I had on Francis of Assisi. And this whole notion that for Francis, to get in touch with a sense of compassion for all that Christ Jesus has done for us was really just an essential part of walking the way, of part of this Jesus movement that the presiding bishop frequently refers to. And so Francis's big question was, how do I help the individual believer to experience compassion? And some of his ideas included the creation of the nativity set. The Franciscans really promoted that because the hope was that when one saw the infant lying in such humble surroundings, one might feel something, emotional intelligence might draw forth a sense of compassion, of empathy. And then Francis was also, besides the creche, besides the nativity scene, was really big on promoting the way of the cross, the Via Dolorosa. And I had an opportunity this Lent to listen to some reflections sponsored by the Episcopal Migration Ministries. It was just an incredible series of recordings on each one of the stations of the cross. And it just made me it gave me an opportunity to resonate with this Franciscan theme of how do I feel compassion for Christ, and then by extension for all who belong to Christ, that is for our brothers and sisters throughout the world.
Yeah, in one of my sermons, I talked about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which is not endemic to Episcopalianism, except if you're an Anglo-Catholic, and how that can connect us to compassion, and then also the crucifix of seeing Jesus' body as not as it to help us connect with those people in our society who are broken and who we're seeing in coronavirus. We're seeing the inequalities becoming clearer. So I think those kinds of images can help us get in touch with compassion in a way that many Episcopalians are not really used to. So you and I are singing off the same page in the hymn book, which is good.
Those images might, for some, I think, may seem a little gory, perhaps. But I think the wisdom behind those images, the crucifixion, the nativity set, the exposed, wounded heart of the Lord, is just really an invitation for us to plug into this fundamental part of discipleship, and that is what does it mean to walk with another who is suffering? I'm a big freak on etymology, and so the etymological basis for the word compassion is to suffer with, to suffer with another, not over and above as rescuer to victim, but as this walking partner.
Great.
And so what does it mean to walk alongside of the one who suffers. And you mentioned the work of Children's Home of Northern Kentucky, and how does one find meaning in the face of indifference or in the midst of despair? And I would submit that that is a key feature to daily life at Children's Home of Northern Kentucky, where we are working with so many who have experienced child abuse, child neglect, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, toxic childhood stress. And I just know from talking to so many of our fellow parishioners at Trinity, you don't have to be an employee at Children's Home of Northern Kentucky to be doing that kind of accompaniment. I think about the number of parishioners who are involved in education, who are involved as CASA volunteers, who have special roles to play in educational circles around students who may be deaf or hard of hearing. There's just so many examples within the parish. Teaming up with people who are homeless and who are needing meals prepared or who are needing shelter. I mean, it's just a beautiful thing to be in a parish community where people know how to walk with another in the midst of that kind of indifference and despair.
And one of the things that you and I were talking about too was, and you alluded to it, the stance at what is the stance you come to this with? And so the Stephen ministers, for example, read part of Henry Nouwen's book, The Wounded Healer. How can our vulnerability, our wounds, because vulness is the root, if we're going to talk about etymology, of woundedness, how do we use our wounds, not to push somebody away or as a way to say, poor, pitiful me, but as a way to be more compassionate, knowing that we are all wounded healers. We have the opportunity to be wounded healers is another way of putting that. And I think the other thing that we talked about yesterday, which really resonated with me, was in that is when you were giving the example that when a child, when a kind act is done to a child, they might not respond with the kind of gratitude that we have come to expect, and they might try to push you away or even swear at you. And thinking about that from a viewpoint of vulnerability and compassion, I loved, and I shared this with you yesterday, Brene Brown's idea that we have to say to ourselves and believe that everybody's doing the best they can in the circumstances in which they find themselves. And so we don't have to respond in anger or in withdrawal. But that's a really hard road to walk when somebody is trying to get at you.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it almost feels like there is a need for a chapter in our discussion entitled When Compassion Doesn't Come Easily. Mm-hmm. And compassion doesn't come easily many times. And part of that could be that I adopt this myth that in order to extend compassion, in order to walk with another who's suffering, I have to be the one who's all together. This notion that someone comes to me broken and it's my job to fix the person. This kind of rescuer victim mentality. At Children's Home, we work really hard with our staff to make sure that we don't buy into that myth, because it will lead to compassion fatigue very quickly. We celebrate our own woundedness and the fact that when I come to work, I bring my entire self, my whole self to work. And many times what that means is I bring with me perhaps a resentment of a discussion that didn't go well with my spouse that morning, or an incident that didn't go well that was totally unrelated to my work, but I bring that with me. I don't leave it at work. So I think, when compassion doesn't come easily, there's an immediate invitation to look at myself and ask myself, how am I feeling today? And am I in touch with my own woundedness and my own lack of put togetherness? Because that's precisely where healing will come. You mentioned too the flip side, that outside of myself, sometimes other people are hard to care for by the way by their thought processes, by their behaviors, and that can just really be true, not only for children, but it can be true. I certainly, I've had discussions with you before about what does it mean to be a pastor? What does it mean to be a priest? What does it mean to be a minister? And we jokingly referred to this phrase that's not original with me, but sometimes the sheep have teeth, and it can be very difficult to minister to another. That's certainly not something the clergy have a corner on the market from. That could be Stephen ministers, it could be teachers. Parents sense that, I'm sure, on a weekly basis when they're trying to extend care to a child who may not only be non-appreciative, but actually hostile to someone trying to reach out in compassion. And I think on that note, one thing that has helped me personally working with the sanctuary model of trauma-informed care at the children's home is this question, this moving away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. That's really a way of giving that person a full benefit of the doubt, that your behaviors are springing forth from some history or some experience. And rather than approach this in a judgmental, negative way of what's wrong with you? Why would you say such a thing? Why would you engage in such a behavior? Why would you commit such an aggressive act of violence? Moving away from that and toward what happened. And many times what we find out is that there is hurt, or you often talk about the role of shame in our lives, that many times those kind of things left unchecked or unexamined can produce some really, can produce some items that make it hard to extend care to that person.
Yeah. On a related note, and because sometimes I think that those of us who are fixers and people pleasers and all those things, and there are many of us, the hardest thing is not to to extend compassion, but to have compassion extended to us and to be able to receive that in the spirit in which it's given. I know that's true for me, and I know it's true for other people who struggle with that, of being the recipient of compassion. It can be very uncomfortable because you have to, that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of being, I just lost my thought because my thing went off, where we really have to bring our woundedness to that. When we're sort of in our professional woundedness or our kind of best behavior woundedness, that's okay. But when it really gets into the real stuff of our lives, I think, and we need to ask for compassion and help, that can be really, really difficult.
Yeah, so. Right on. I think about going back to our earlier discussion about Francis of Assisi and the way of the cross. I'm just so intrigued by the number of times that Christ himself, our brother Jesus, has an opportunity to be the recipient of care on that road to Calvary. I mean, I'm thinking about the whole image of Veronica and the wiping of the Lord's face. I'm thinking about the need of Simon of Cyrene to help carry the cross. I'm thinking about the fact that there's not even a tomb with Jesus's name on it, that even the tomb is an act of kindness from Joseph of Arimathea. All of these traditions and these scriptural references pointing to the fact that Christ is not only the extender of healing, that he's modeling what it means to be a recipient in those instances as well.
Right. No, I think about, the woman washing his feet, all those places where he is cared for. And that he can serve then, I hadn't thought about it, but that's a really good point, is he can serve as a model of how we can receive compassion as our Lord received compassion.
Right, and at the end of the day, I think what makes compassion so unique in the context of Trinity, in the context of our parish that gathers either in person or, in this case, in this day and age, remotely, as we are gathered around that altar, the mystery really that we grapple with is that it's not just the efforts of Trinity parishioners or Trinity clergy or Trinity Stephen ministers themselves extending care. It's really Christ acting within his corporate body, this body of believers, so that truly, I mean, it may sound cliche-ish, but I think it's the truth of the gospel. It's not just Peter or Rick and their activities. It really is Christ, allowing Christ to work in us and through us. And it's his power and energy that we depend upon, because left to our own devices, we stumble and fall. And so this whole necessity of coming to the Eucharist, being nurtured by word, being nurtured by sacrament, being nurtured by our brothers and sisters in community, that keeps those channels of grace open and moving so that compassion can grow all the more.
Great. And when compassion is growing and we're enabling it, to return it to Assisi. St. Clare of Assisi says we are Christ's, hands and feet in the world, and Christ's heart in the world as well. And so I think that's a great place to leave I could talk to you for another half hour, but I think it's a great place to leave our discussion. I want to thank you for coming and talking with us today. And to the folks who are listening, if there's anything that you want me to talk about, any topic you want me to talk about, any guest you want me to have, just let me know. My email address is rector@trinitycovington.org, rector@trinitycovington.org. So I'll see you in church.